We've all had those moments during our many playthroughs of Final Fantasy games where it felt like all was lost. Our heroes felt overwhelmed and the enemy just felt too strong. And those were the moments where summoners were best placed to call upon a higher power that could try and save the day. Those powers have taken on numerous forms, from mythical beings, powerful creatures, or even gods, and they have often been as colourful and diverse as they have been powerful. But without the summoner, that power is difficult to tame. As highly skilled magic users, being able to wield that power has served as a core function of summoners. But they have also been skilled in other schools of magic, sometimes doubling as black mages or white mages. In certain titles, summoners even gained prominent lore, with entire Final Fantasy narratives revolving around their powers and their personal journeys. That's why they've become so iconic, and it's why we're excited to explore this topic in our typical granular style. So sit back and relax as we explore the complete evolution of summoners. The act of summoning may have been inspired by the practice of evocation. This often revolved around a magical practitioner performing a ritual to call forth an otherworldly entity such as a spirit, deity, or demon. But summoning might also relate to the concept of familiars, supernatural beings that usually took on the form of an animal. Both concepts have seen many depictions in fantasy and fiction. Throughout ancient myths and legends, the image of a magician calling forth mighty elemental or mythical beings is a classic fantasy trope. Dungeons and Dragons also featured evocation and conjuration as schools of arcane magic. And with the right spells at hand, magic users were able to launch devastating area of effect attacks and conjure all manner of assistance, from celestial and elemental beings to feyfolk and woodland creatures. Other fictional works have imagined a darker side on summoning and evocation. The works of H.P. Lovecraft contained forbidden knowledge and rituals used to summon demons and other supernatural beings. But doing this almost always came at a dire cost for those involved. It's interesting to note that the author also made reference to aeons in his work, one of the many terms that ended up being used to describe summonable beings in the Final Fantasy franchise. The summoner job first graced the Final Fantasy series back in 1990 with Final Fantasy III. It was one of several new jobs made available from the Earth Crystal, and it served as an upgraded form of the Evoker class. According to the game's manual, summoners were magic users who harnessed the power of high summoning, and this was a type of magic that was effective against a large group of enemies. To help accomplish this, summoners were given high intelligence and had access to a large pool of MP, but as might be expected, their physical attributes were quite low by comparison. In combat, this manifested as summoners could only arm themselves with staves and were a selection of light armour, robes and braces. But even in this early form, summoning was portrayed as a discipline that required a great deal of practice, skill and dedication. Whereas the Evoker was considered to be an initiate of summon magic, and this was why they always had a 50-50 chance of a black or white magic effect, the summoner was shown to have mastered the abilities. By eliminating the random factor, this meant summoners always performed a high summoning. The next upgrade, or natural progression for the summoner though, was the Sage. The Sage was considered a master of black, white, and summon magic, and it served as the most powerful magic casting job in the game. This meant that when the Sage became available, the summoner was effectively replaced. Due to the nature of the discipline, summon magic could be initially purchased from in-game shops, usable by anyone who decided to try and master the craft. But some summons had to be sought out. This added an extra dimension to the gameplay and made mastering the summon job an adventure in itself. Final Fantasy III also established a signature look for summoners. When adopting the role, characters were drawn in a set of green robes. They were also given a horn that appeared to stick out of their forehead. And these elements all combined to create a solid foundation for future developers to call from. Final Fantasy IV saw two major developments in the evolution of the summoner job. One, summoners were depicted as a group of people with special abilities that had been handed down through generations, and 2, a dedicated party member represented the summoner job, and that party member was Rydia. Over the course of the game, we saw Rydia's journey from a frightened orphaned girl to a brave and elegant heroine. Through this, the narrative connection between the summoners and the monsters or called beast was also established, and Rydia's character development made for some memorable story moments. However, it was only once Rydia was thought dead, but then returned to her friends as a grown woman, that players got to see the evolution of the summoner job present itself. It was revealed that Leviathan, the beast that had swallowed Rydia, had taken her to the Feymarch, the homeworld of the summons, where time passed at a different rate from the physical realm. This idea shared some similarities with the Irish folk legend of Tir na Noeg, except time in the Feymarch passed rapidly rather than slowing down, and this caused Rydia to age over a decade during her brief absence. It was during this time that she learnt to master her skills, and when she returned, Rydia was a very different proposition. Combining summoning with black magic, Rydia could learn every black magic spell in the game up to and including Meteor. She was also able to learn some white magic spells as a child, but she appeared to have lost or forgotten them by the time she returned as an adult. Another feature that stood out was her use of whips. As whips had been used for taming and training wild animals, this was a fitting weapon of choice for a character who could attack by deploying summoned creatures. Additionally, Rydia could fight using rods and daggers, or staves when she was a child. In the 2D versions, Rydia was also able to equip bows and arrows. As her attacks were focused on summoning and offensive magic though, both versions of Rydia had high magical stats to compensate for her low physical ones. The visual aesthetic of Rydia built on what was established in Final Fantasy III. Much like the summoner robes, Rydia's hair and clothing were bright emerald green in colour. And as an adult, her costume also featured long flowing sleeves, similar to those of a traditional robe, but it was designed as a fitted bodysuit with cutaways on the upper arms and thighs that gave Rydia a striking look of her own. She also wore a variety of hair ornaments, which gave her extra colour and flair. But there was no horn. Regardless, Rydia served as a strong representation for a standalone summoner and introduced quite a few narrative devices. She was a young woman who was orphaned during her childhood, and there was a strong theme of overcoming loss and trauma for the greater good, as well as the notion of narrative progression to master the job. Final Fantasy V saw a return to the job class system, and with it, a return of the summoner as an individual job. Obtained after shattering the water crystal, the summoner job allowed characters to access the highest magic power boost in most versions of the game. This was also the game that introduced the recurring item Magic Lamp as an alternative means of summoning. Final Fantasy V, though, saw greater utility with summoner abilities than ever before, and this was thanks to some of the new summoned monsters that were made available in the game. As well as the standard summon command, characters could also learn the new call ability, and this enabled them to call forth a random summon with 0 MP cost. While this could be risky, as the summon's elemental type wouldn't always work in your favour, it was very useful if the summoner had burned through all of their MP. Appearance-wise, this summoner was also very similar to the 2 previous games. It shared the same green and gold colour palette, and the summoner's horn made a return. But this time, there was a bit more individuality between the character sprites. The summoner's signature weapons were rods, and like most other jobs in the game, they were also able to wield knives. After Final Fantasy V, even though summoners continued to feature and even had their roles in association to the narrative and gameplay expanded, the role of the specific summoner was diminished. It wasn't until Final Fantasy Tactics that this notion was reverted, as the summoner job returned with gusto. Unlocked after upgrading a Time Mage unit to level 3, summoners could call upon powerful spirits known as Espers, and as mage units, summoners were a force to be reckoned with. Not only could they cover large areas of effect and deal massive amounts of damage, their summon attacks ignored any allied units, eliminating the risk of friendly fire. Summoners also saw the best MP growth in the game, which helped to offset the cost of their attacks and made up for their relatively low physical strength. The default artwork for the male and female summoner had them in long, moss green pattern robes with gold fastenings for the males and gold trim at the bottom of the female cloak. But their in-game sprites were drawn with a much brighter shade of green. Both summoners wore black clothing under green cloaks, with red and gold detail visible on the female character's sleeves and reddish-brown boots drawn for the male version. Summoners in Tactics also sported a red headpiece with a long red horn sticking out of the forehead. 13 different espers were made available to summoner units, and the game introduced unique ways of obtaining them. The most common was grinding for enough job points, which could be very time consuming, but summoners also had the chance at learning new summons after being hit by an opponent's esper attack, provided they managed to take damage without being KO'd. This method was the only way of obtaining Zodiark, the most powerful esper in the game. To accomplish this, players needed to go up against an optional superboss called Elidibus with a summoner in their party, and survive being hit by Zodiark's attack. But even getting to this boss battle was no easy task. Final Fantasy IX represented a huge milestone in the evolution of the summoner job, both in terms of the game's lore and through having not one, but 2 party members who were dedicated summoners. These included the game's deuteragonist, Princess Garnet, and 6-year-old Eiko Carol, both of whom shared a unique connection with summonable beings known as Eidolons. Both characters looked quite different from the summoners we'd seen in the past, at least in some respects. Gone were the green robes in favour of Garnet's orange jumpsuit over a white blouse, and Eiko's primary bright colours, which reflected her young age and disposition. However, Eiko's concept art actually showed her dressed in green clothing and accessories with a green tinge in her hair. We also saw some green details in Garnet's formal dress, one at several points throughout the game, both in her jewellery and the pattern of green leaves. The other curious aspect here was that Garnet and Eiko were not just summoners, but also the party's white mages, and there were also plenty of nods towards those jobs. Most notably, Garnet was shown wearing a white mage's cloak from the original Final Fantasy as she escaped from the royal palace. Eiko was able to also learn Holy, one of the most powerful white mage spells. This was also the first time we saw a summoner with a particular elemental connection, which was also shared with Eiko's Eidolon Medine, and reflected in the decorative angel wings that were part of Eiko's outfit. Now, unlike Rydia, both Garnet and Eiko were born with summoners' horns growing out of their foreheads, which helped them to communicate with the Eidolons. This marked the first time in Final Fantasy history that the horn was confirmed to be a physical trait of summoners and not just a decorative headdress or accessory. Garnet's horn was never seen though, as it was surgically removed during her early childhood. Nevertheless, she was still able to harness the power of her Eidolons and become a fully fledged summoner. Eiko's horn even grew larger during her trance mode, as if to highlight the horn as a source of her powers. To work along with this, perhaps unsurprisingly, Final Fantasy IX introduced some in-depth summoner lore to its world building, and this built upon what was seen in Final Fantasy IV. In this world, the summoners were a group of people who had dedicated their lives to the study of Eidolons. But there was more. Summoners had spent centuries learning to hone their skills, but it hadn't all been positive. After a summoning experiment gone wrong, the summoners were forced to leave the Mist Continent, setting up a new home in the village of Madain Sari. There the summoners lived peacefully until their home was attacked by Garland's warship, leaving few survivors. Just like in Final Fantasy IV, they were considered to be a threat by one of the game's antagonists and were required to be eliminated. Gameplay-wise, both of the party's summoners had access to different sets of Eidolons, and while there was a good deal of crossover, they each had unique spells, abilities, and weapons. Both used rackets, for example, but Garnet could also equip rods, and Eiko could use flutes. Garnet was also able to call on a wider variety of summons, including a range of elemental-themed Eidolons, and Arc, the most powerful summon in the game. Eiko, on the other hand, had the ability to alter the attacks and effects of her summons by equipping jewels and other add-ons. Aspects of the gameplay also helped to convey the summoner's spiritual and emotional journeys. Technically, Garnet had always had the ability to summon Eidolons, but the high MP cost restricted her from doing so in the early game. This showed that, while summoning was a power Garnet had inherited, it was also a connection she'd lost. And this served as another poignant connection to Final Fantasy IV. But the backstories of Rydia, Garnet and Eiko shared many similarities. Each of them hailed from a long line of summoners. All three were orphaned at an early age, with them seeing their homes destroyed in an attack. And the connection between Rydia and Garnet was even stronger as their stories involved overcoming trauma and finding the inner strength to continue. They both lost their mothers during the aforementioned attacks from one of the main antagonists before going through some kind of transformation and ending up stronger than they were before. Final Fantasy X continued to place a spotlight on summoners, but the focus was now very different. This time, instead of being powerful but persecuted individuals, summoners were powerful and revered. And that was because the power they wielded was the only known way to defeat Sin, a cyclical being that plagued the land. Focus in this game was placed on Yuna, a novice summoner. Her initial powers were limited, but just as Rydia and Garnet had done in games prior, Yuna sought to improve her proficiency. And this took place via a pilgrimage, which served as the literal embodiment of the journey summoners had taken in previous games, just stretched out and formalised. But there were some other narrative traits too. Final Fantasy IV introduced a connection so strong between a summoner and their summon that it could even result in death. And in Final Fantasy X, summoners knew that their life was forfeit should they achieve their goal of defeating Sin. Most were unawares as to why, but it resulted in them being consumed by the final Aeon. Yuna herself was also an orphan, another common trait, and one of her parents was also a summoner. But he was not just any summoner. Braska was one of the few to defeat Sin and had gained the title of High Summoner. This then served as a reference back to Final Fantasy III, where summoners used high summoning to call forth their powerful beasts. Yuna's appearance also added some new elements to the summoner class. Her outfit was inspired by Japanese shrine maidens with long sleeves that flowed as she moved. Her dress reinforced the idea of a summoner's spirituality, while the sleeves created striking visuals whenever Yuna raised her wand to summon Aeons, cast spells, or danced as she performed the sending ritual. But beyond the summoner designation, Yuna also fulfilled the cross role of White Mage, and she wore white and pink clothing that had been associated with other White Mage hybrid roles. But Summoner was still her official occupation within the story, and she was the only playable character capable of using the Summon Command ability. As a magic user, it meant Yuna's initial stats favoured high magic and magic defense over her strength and physical defense, while her high evasion and agility helped to compensate for low accuracy. She could use rings as armour and rods as weapons, and the summons then acted as an extension of her, literally in battle. Instead of coming to save the day by performing a single area of effect attack, summoners now had complete control, and this meant their summons joined the battle, and players could then use an array of select moves in place of the party. Aeons could also be dismissed at any time, and each Aeon had its own HP, MP, and overdrive gauge. Yuna's own overdrive, called Grand Summon, then allowed her to summon an Aeon with its ultimate attack already prepared. This meant that while summoners had been integral to the plot of numerous games, Final Fantasy X really elevated these notions by creating a much stronger bond between summon and summoner from both a narrative and a gameplay perspective. For Final Fantasy XI, the summoner job was once again able to be taken on by player characters of all shapes and sizes. But due to its designation as an advanced job, there were some prerequisites that had to be met in order to unlock the class, and even more quests then needed to be fulfilled in order to master its full set of skills. This was therefore similar to previous jobs where summoners started out with limited functionality before then being able to enhance themselves if they proved themselves worthy in battle. While exact appearance could vary thanks to the game having customizable player avatars, the general vibe was quite classic, even including the horn. The artifact armour, known as the Evoker's attire, then featured natural shades of green, with the superior set known as the Summoner's attire featuring shades of blue. Both, however, featured a red horn, which was last seen in Final Fantasy Tactics. While colours and details varied in both the game and concept art, Final Fantasy XI retained the idea of showing an affectionate bond between summoners and their avatars. Gameplay function was similar to what was seen in Final Fantasy X, as summoners were joined on the battlefield by their avatars. They could then perform a wide range of attacks, debuffs and support moves thanks to their individual blood pacts, but these now used the summoner's MP as opposed to their own MP pool. Astral Flow also served as a subtle nod back to Yuna, who could enhance summons by utilising her own special ability. This time, summoners could also conjure a variety of elemental spirits, representing the 8 elements found in the game. Elements could be bought through scrolls dropped by vanquished enemies from merchants or through the game's auction house, and this all made the summoner a versatile job, and they were often paired well with the White Mage as a sub-job. But should there be more focus on damage dealing, Red Mage or Black Mage was viable too, and this then lent into some of the more notable summoners of the past. The summoner role next appeared in Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. However, there was one major change made to the role, as the job was now exclusive to the Viera race. In many ways, this alignment made sense in universe though. As we've come to discover in the Ivalice series, the Viera were highly attuned to the green world. Concept art for the summoner also incorporated many traditional colours and features of the job. The attire showed natural shades of green, brown and blue, topped off with a headpiece that featured a golden horn. The summoner's in-game sprite on the Game Boy Advance showed predominantly green clothing and a green cape, while the palette swap featured purple clothing but also had green hair. The summoner's stats featured the highest MP, magic power and resistance of all the jobs available to the Viera, but this was then offset by low HP, attack, defense and speed. The idea of Holy as the summoner's elemental alignment, as seen in Final Fantasy IX, was then reinforced in Tactics Advance. Out of the 8 available espers, 3 of them, Unicorn, Phoenix and Medine, were aligned with the Holy element. Unlocking the summoner job was also accomplished by learning 2 white mage abilities and 2 elementalist abilities. The connection to the elementalist echoed the elemental nature of many summonable beings and was also a subtle nod to Final Fantasy XI, and the association with the white mage was very much in line with other summoners such as in Final Fantasy IX and X. However, this was not the only connection between Tactics Advance and these particular games. Summons, this time known as espers, were learned through equipping different staves, many of which included references to characters from 9 and 10. These included the Nirvana Staff, which shared its name with Yuna's celestial weapon, and the Garnet Staff. Summoners could also use the Cheer Staff to call upon Medine, who'd been the friend and protector of Eiko. The other important note is that one of the most famous summoners from within the lore of this particular game was called Lianan, who was also a songstress, and that then connects with Final Fantasy X too. The sequel to Final Fantasy X saw the return of Yuna, who'd now earned the title of High Summoner, but Spira was now a post-Yevon, post-Aeon world. This meant there was no longer a need for summoners, and freed from the burdens of duty and self-sacrifice, Yuna exhibited a more carefree attitude, albeit only for a time. Things changed when Yuna became wrapped up in a new plot that revolved around Shuyin and a songstress called Len. Now, Len and Lianan from Tactics Advance are not quite the same name, but they are very close, and they were both songstresses. The songstress itself was also an interesting concept, as Len's essence was contained within it and worked via her connection with Yuna. When equipped, Yuna was able to use a range of status and support magic, not unlike some white magic abilities learnt by Garnet and Eiko in Final Fantasy IX. In an FMV sequence, we also saw her unintentionally summoning Len's spirit on stage as the two joined each other in song. Beyond the connections with Tactics Advance though, the relationship between summoners and songstresses was not entirely new to the series. Garnet was often heard singing a melody, which was one of her connections with the summoner tribe she'd been born into. Eiko's surname was also Carol, another reference to songs and singing, plus she was able to use flutes as weapons. One other amusing detail featured in this game was the statue of Yuna built by the Ronso tribe on Mount Gargazet. To honour the young summoner, the Ronso had promised to build a statue of Yuna with a great horn on her head, though Yuna herself had no such appendage. This was obviously because the Ronso took enormous pride in their own horns, but it also served as a subtle homage to the roots of the summoner. Although the Final Fantasy III Remake was similar in many ways to the original game, due to how much time had passed and the advancements in technology and consumer expectations, the developers opted to make some subtle changes. From a visual perspective, this meant the horn that featured as part of the summoner garb was made to look much more artificial. There were also 2 variants of colour, with the majority of the characters having green horns and Ignis having a black horn. Gold also became a more prominent colour, used on the trimming of the jacket and cloak and at the base of Refria's skirt, and white also became much more pronounced. From a functional perspective, things were also changed. Even though the sage had access to white and black magic, as in the original game, as well as summon magic, there was still merit in sticking with the summoner job this time around. Due to sages having access to such a huge volume of spells, they were switched to only being able to use the evoker versions of summons. This meant the summoner was the only way to make use of each summon's high summon ability. Final Fantasy Tactics A2 adopted a similar stance to its predecessor. This meant the summoner job was exclusive to the Viera race, and it had incredible damage dealing potential due to the job's very high magic power attribute growth. However, summoners were made even more frail, as their physical attributes were downgraded even further. And perhaps to nerf the job slightly, they were also given low MP growth. This meant players had to make sure to use the half MP support skill. The other interesting aspect around A2 was that summoners were not the only job able to use summons. As an allusion to the past, animalists were able to use the friend command to call upon a random summon. This was nearly identical to the call command previously associated with summoners, with the only major difference being that to use the ability this time consumed MP. As if to further emphasize the purposeful nature of this, the animalist's main command was referred to as calling. When Final Fantasy IV was expanded, a similar approach was taken to how they had approached Final Fantasy III. But this time they also had a sequel called The After Years, and one of the episodes was focused on Rydia. After helping to rebuild Mist, Rydia returns to visit the Feymarch only to be cast out by Asura. Once she came to, Rydia discovered that all the Eidolons had been petrified. This sent her on a quest to save the Eidolons and solve the mystery of what had happened to them. Only the Mist Dragon, the Eidolon connected to Rydia's mother, remained uncorrupted. Thanks to her pre-existing bond, Rydia was then able to trigger an emotional response to each of the Eidolons in turn, causing them to awaken and return to their true selves. And this spoke to Rydia needing to undertake a pilgrimage of sorts. In the earlier game, Rydia was meant to be more reliant on black magic skills, with this changing as she gained access to more summons. But depending on choices made while playing the game, certain summons may also be lost for good. Summoner was one of the 8 starting jobs in Final Fantasy Dimensions, available to both the Warriors of Light and the Warriors of Darkness. And due to the array of characters, we got some nice visual evolutions. Aegis wore the traditional green robes, while Nacht wore blue, a seldom used colour. But it was Sol who deviated away from the norm. Robes had almost always been green or blue in association with summoners, but Sol wore red robes. This might have been a purposeful nod to the horn though, as summoner horns had almost always been red. Other characters showed even more variations though. Sarah wore orange over white sleeves, which was the colour scheme used by Garnet in Final Fantasy IX, with Sarah also being Garnet's birth name. Each character was shown with gold detail in their robes and a gold horn pointing out of their heads, and they all wore pendants with coloured gemstones, with green gems for male characters and red stones for female characters. Summoners had high stats in intelligence and mind, and low stats for HP, vitality and strength. They also had below average speed. And as well as knives, rods and staves, summoners could choose to arm themselves with whips, making it one of the only games to use this as a summoner weapon since Final Fantasy IV. Dimensions also brought back the call ability first seen in Final Fantasy V, and this again allowed them to call forth an Eidolon at random without using any MP. How summoners grew and obtained their powers was also reminiscent of the past, and differed from the other mages. While black and white magic spells had to be purchased, summoners had to gain new Eidolons by completing optional dungeons near the end of each chapter, and this ticked the pilgrimage box that was starting to become quite pronounced. Most summons needed to be defeated in a boss battle before they could be recruited, though there were some exceptions. The Unicorn, for example, was instead persuaded to assist the team. Dimensions also introduced fusion abilities, special moves that could be executed by a character who'd learnt 2 particular skills. This gave summoners access to some extremely powerful moves and attacks, such as Mega Rise and Giga Flare. However, because the Eidolons were initially split between dark and light groups, characters may only be able to access certain fusion abilities later in the game. In the sequel, summoners did not return in the traditional job sense. However, many summoner characters from the rest of the series did appear as signets, and a summoner signet was available to Journey. The artwork for this signet then showed a female summoner with green robes, gold accessories, and a red horn surrounded by glowing green orbs. The summoner returned as a job in Final Fantasy XIV, where it was introduced in A Realm Reborn. Alongside the Scholar, the summoner was one of 2 possible upgrades for the Arcanist, and it was made available once the player reached level 30. But while Scholars focused on healing, summoners were classified as magical range DPS units. After completing the job quest, players were granted the Soul of the Summoner Crystal. This then allowed for the Summoner job upgrade, along with the ability to call Ifrit, Lord of the Inferno. While the Arcanists could manipulate energy in order to manifest familiars, summoners combined other forms of energy to manifest godlike beings known as primals. But rather than summoning the primals themselves, summoners were able to call upon lesser versions to do their bidding. Completing class quests allowed summoners to manifest different versions and unlock new magical abilities. And from a lore perspective, there were some similarities with previous games, but also some key differences. Summons were associated with the various beast tribes of Eorzea, who had been taught the lost art of primal summoning by the Ascians towards the end of the 6th Astral Era. Their abilities were feared and distrusted by Eorzea's city-states, who viewed them as a danger and a threat. And this had parallels to the likes of Final Fantasy IV and IX, where the fear of summoner tribes and their powers led to attacks on Mist and Madain Sari. One of the main reasons primals were so feared, aside from their capacity to deal damage, was their ability to enthrall and temper those in their presence. This process, referred to by the Allagans as the iconic corruption, eroded the victim's free will and replaced it with fanatical devotion. Long thought to be incurable, tempered victims had often been put to their death in order to weaken the primal's power. However, thanks to Hydaelyn's blessing and the power of the Eiko, the player character was given immunity to primal tempering. Primals also drew the life of the world around them to ensure they could continue to function, and this constituted another threat, as they could soon render their surroundings uninhabitable. This meant the lore leaned into the darker aspects of summoning. Previous games had touched upon this, especially within Final Fantasy X, so it was interesting to see the darker subject matter explored in such detail. Alongside the lore developments, summoners also had an evolution in terms of their weapon choice. Rods had featured a long-standing association with summoners, but in Final Fantasy XIV they now used books. These had seldom featured throughout the mainline series, but equipping the Arcanist Grimoire books in Final Fantasy XIV boosted the player's intelligence, which was the primary attribute of the summoner job. Artwork for summoners depicted characters in classic green robes wearing red horned pieces. They were usually posed holding their book in one hand, while the other free hand performed their summoning abilities. However, as Final Fantasy XIV evolved, so too did the artifact armor. The original set featured a red horn, white garb and green cloak, complete with gold embellishment. Heaven's Ward then expanded the horn and reduced the green, while Stormblood diminished the horn and ditched the green altogether. Shadowbringers then brought the green back with red flourishes, while Endwalker had a primary focus on white. World of Final Fantasy celebrated 30 years of the franchise and brought together many of the series' most beloved characters. Mid Grimoire was home to alternate versions of many of these characters, and among them were 3 of the most famous summoners, Rydia, Eiko, and Yuna. While the Mirages were technically summoned beings themselves, summoners from their respective games were still recognised by their unique talents. Each of these characters was seen accompanied by one of their Eidolons or Aeons too, and this meant Yuna was with Velfor, Rydia was with the Mist Dragon, and Eiko was with Fenrir. Eiko was also seen awakening Alexander with green glowing lights visible when she used her powers. World of Final Fantasy also saw many of their original story beats reimagined, and their personality traits remained intact. We even saw summoners supporting each other, as Yuna helped Rydia overcome her fear of fire before the battle against Ifrita. Summoner returned as an expert job in Stranger of Paradise, but it wasn't included in the base game. Instead, it came via the Trials of the Dragon King DLC alongside the Pilgrim and the Evoker. And to unlock the job, players needed to beat the final boss of the DLC, Bahamut. What we then saw was quite different from previous summoners. For example, whereas many had started out with just one summon, Jack was restricted to only one summon, with no chance of learning any more. That one summon was Bahamut though, and activating the summon ability saw Jack summon an image of Bahamut, which then remained until Jack's MP bar was depleted. Similar to the likes of Final Fantasy X and XI, this meant the summon became an extension of the summoner. And alongside numerous standard attacks, this granted Jack access to the likes of Mega Flare, Giga Flare and Exa Flare. But Stranger of Paradise also offered variety. Evoker had been long established in Final Fantasy III as a lesser variant of the summoner job, and it was superseded in that particular iteration by the Sage. But here we had some specific iterations that went beyond the summoner. By offering rat tails to Bahamut, players were able to grow their summoners in new directions, and this manifested through the Demonologist and the High Summoner. The concept of summoning has been most recently seen in Final Fantasy XVI. However, this was very much a departure from the traditional summoning. Trailers for the game showed a high degree of focus on summonable beings, that were this time known as icons. These included new versions of staples such as Shiva, Ifrit, and Bahamut. Clearly, these characters were meant to play a major role in the narrative, but as summons, they weren't quite what we'd come to expect. Instead of being called by someone who adopted the summoner role, each icon was controlled by a designated human known as a dominant. The summoning was therefore much more visceral, as the dominants transformed into their respective icons to the detriment of their own health. The idea of having icons tied to a particular person was similar to what we'd already seen with the icons in Final Fantasy IV and IX. However, the way it was woven into the story was what gave Final Fantasy XVI a whole new spin on the meaning of summoning. The curious aspect, however, was just how similar the concept had remained from its inception through to the more modern installments. From Final Fantasy IV onwards, the narrative role of the summoner seemed quite ingrained. Instead of just growing through the gaining of arbitrary levels, the chosen character often needed to go through some kind of pilgrimage in order to unlock their full potential. Summoners have also been persecuted for their perceived power, with antagonists attempting to neuter them due to the threat they pose. In later years, the connection between summoner and summon has also been explored in imaginative ways. This has seen summoners integrate into the worlds themselves, with clear explanations given as to how and why summoners can call upon them for aid. And this means that even though the concept of jobs themselves have seemed to fall by the wayside, the notion of summoners has not, as even Final Fantasy XVI incorporated specific narrative elements into its jobless setting. It's unclear what the future holds for summoners in terms of their specific role, but this highlights a willingness for the developers to keep the notion of summoning alive, as even though summons can exist without summoners, they do have a very close and often intertwined relationship. But as we've now reached the conclusion of this study, we'd like to ask you which you feel is the ultimate iteration of the summoner, or who is your favourite representation of the summoner. Also, if you found this video insightful, we'd very much appreciate any interactions you could offer in terms of liking the video, commenting, or sharing it around to people who you think just might enjoy watching it. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, Chris M. Walker, Christopher Gardner, Clever Chavez, EXP Required on YouTube, Gregory and Steven, who are super special Onion Eye supporters, and of course a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.